Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Modern software development and deployment paradigms require security testing solutions that are automated, accurate, and integrate into your DevOps workflow. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools, including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker, to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. Sysdig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using Sysdig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. Sysdig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using Sysdig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Sysdig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman. Mark your calendars for our Security Weekly Holiday Extravaganza. On December 19th, Security Weekly will be live streaming 5 one-hour panel discussions with some of the most knowledgeable professionals in the industry. To round out the evening, Ed Skudis will be joining the Security Weekly hosts to give his annual announcement about the CounterHack Holiday Hack Challenge. You can view the live stream on our YouTube channel or by visiting securityweekly.com/live. We hope to see you there. Attend RSA Conference 2020 from February 24th to 28th and join thousands of security professionals, forward-thinking innovators, and solution providers for 5 days of actionable learning, inspiring conversation, and breakthrough ideas. Register before January 24th and save $900 on a full conference pass. Save an extra $150 by going to securityweekly.com/RSAC2020 and use our code to register. Well, Matt, we just had a great discussion about bots and bot platforms for today being Cyber Monday. And in the news, we have some news not so much about bots, but about humans doing bad things. And in this case, it was some SDKs that were used in Facebook and Twitter apps that were siphoning data from social media profiles. And one of the reasons I highlighted this is that we've talked before about the software supply chain, talking about the integrity of SDKs, making sure that the code that you built is the binary you deploy and that it hasn't been tampered with. But that's also predicated on the idea that what you're deploying isn't malicious, or perhaps, to use a slightly less loaded term, in a couple cases, it's not against a terms of service, or it's not doing something, say, hinky with user data or unexpected with user data. And I think that's what this article is describing. These SDKs are more so falling into that category, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting attack where they're leveraging the SDKs of some of these mobile marketing tools to actually pull personal data out of these apps, which is, definitely a privacy issue. But the way they're doing it, there's a statement in here from MobaBurn, which is one of the two SDKs, saying, look, we're just providing the toolkit. What people do with it's not our issue. Well, maybe. And I think what I was trying to get to, Mike, and I couldn't really tell from this, is this overlap of some of these applications, right? It looked like these SDKs were able to gain some access into potentially some other areas of the mobile device and the maybe other applications themselves, which I can see definitely happening on the Android platform. My guess is iOS has maybe a little more protections in place, but maybe these SDKs can bypass some of that, which creates a very interesting use case in the iOS mobile system.
Yeah, and I think it's I think your suspicions are are right in the sense that this is much more of an Android ecosystem challenge, because the Android permissions model and the intents tend to be a lot less granular than iOS. and they tend to be deploy. The permissions asked once upon install, and it's usually that install is a massive permissions grab. And so the app may be asking for permissions, but that's because the app doesn't really need access to your camera. But for whatever reason, the SDK wanted access to the camera so that it could then get access to local storage or access to your pictures, or access to other types of permissions such as SMS, things like that. And I think the other thing I'll just highlight of that challenge of the Android ecosystem is that Android, to be fair, has done a really good job in their recent versions to kind of true up that parity with the granular permissions with iOS. Of course, the problem is that the iOS adoption rate for the latest version is really high. Like I think it's in the 90s percentage, whereas with Android, it's I'm trying to remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's nowhere close to 90. I want to say it's even closer to something like 50 or 60% for the latest version. So even if Android is doing better, you still have all these older devices that don't have those protections available, and it's a lot easier to have those, call them data leaks or data grabs based on overly granted intents.
Yeah, Apple's benefit here is they control the hardware and the software platform. And if they want you to upgrade, they're going to force you to upgrade, or they're going to end of life the hardware, which will force you to upgrade. So they have a completely different way to pull that lever than Android does, because again, the hardware ecosystem's so broad, they can't put the same restrictions on it because they don't own all the hardware devices. They only own a portion of the ecosystem when it comes to the Android operating system running on these hardware platforms. So it's definitely more challenging there. And there is no evidence that the Twitter iOS one had any malicious activity, because again, I think it's the permissioning system in iOS that actually prevents this from working in iOS, where Android is much more susceptible to this type of attack.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting also from kind of a user experience and a design perspective too, is that you could perhaps call it kind of nagware or nagging, but iOS puts a lot of these decisions more front and center about reminding users, hey, you granted access to GPS a while ago. Do you still want this app to have it? It's sitting in the background, accessing your location. And it's both a did you know this, as well as you made this decision perhaps a month ago. Do you still have, would you still make that decision today? And I think that's a more interesting approach because it allows people to change their mind. It adds context. And I'd also say we can also talk about a little bit of the business aspect of whether it is more of an app-driven or an ad-driven type of ecosystem that the business is also running on that causes these types of trade-offs between in the decisions and the design. I thought this was also a nice kind of segue into the article about Firefox and Firefox getting tough on tracking tricks. And now I know we've talked about a lot of the browser privacy. Chrome just recently, I think, was one we talked about a few weeks ago, and what Chrome is doing to basically sandbox their processes, as well as make a lot of their APIs, web APIs, less precise, basically. And we've talked about Safari doing the same thing. And here, to be fair to Firefox, Firefox is also trying to do a lot as well. In this case, I don't know that there's necessarily too much new in this article, as much as the article does have a great list of basically side channels that exist in a browser. And the reason I wanted to highlight this was not necessarily to focus on browsers still, but also to talk a little bit more broadly about side channels and information leaks when we as application developers are building our own apps. Because there's a trade-off here in the sense of how precise data we are providing about a user and how that user can be uniquely identified. And just one quick example of that is saying, if we need GPS location coordinates, Matt, if we can be very coarse and we can distinguish that you and I are in different states right now. So, if we're down to 1 kilometer or even a 1,000 kilometer type of precision, that's going to be pretty easy way to distinguish us. Just to figure out that I'm in California, we don't need a latitude and longitude that's really precise, because that type of precision then could start to distinguish me or use to track me, as opposed to what the app might need or what the user might be expecting. So it's one of those areas I just want to that can be turned into, I think, a threat modeling exercise to talk about, you're building an app, what data are you collecting, and do you need to be that precise and that specific about each of your users to accommodate particular workflows?
Yeah, this is a interesting business discussion too for us at Security Weekly, and I've had to deal with this in the past with other companies, right? Marketing people like to use a lot of tracking cookies to figure out, have you been at my site before? What content have you touched, et cetera. So you have a lot of marketing systems out there that will cookie the user, track that user and the activity that they have, and they use this for lead scoring and all these other things. And look, marketing people have been doing this for years. They use it as part of a nurturing campaign. I get it. And so we get a lot of sponsors, Mike, that come in and they're like, yeah, we want to know what users are doing with Security Weekly. And I'm like, I don't know. Here's what I do know, right? I know if you hit a URL and a landing page, I know if you get redirected to a landing page. But outside of that, we don't cookie our users, and I won't on our public website, because it's not what we were meant for. Right. And so it's hard sometimes to educate people on why you don't do that, because I don't want to collect this data. I don't want to be responsible for it in some respects, right? Because that's a business decision we've made. But you have a lot of businesses that want this data. And the question is, how much data do you collect? To what degree do you collect that data? And then if you do collect it, you're going to have to protect it, because that's going to be the other thing that comes and whacks you later when some of this data gets out. So we've made a decision not to do a lot of this stuff. And what you're seeing now is that the browsers are going to make it harder to do this in general anyways. So, for me, it's okay. I think this is a great thing. But I know a lot of companies will struggle going forward with more of these protections in place. But I think it's good for the user, because I think privacy should rule in a lot of respects. And this gives users the option to at least be as anonymous as possible.
Yeah, that's really cool just to hear that thought process and what those decision points are, because you're very rightly point out, I skipped over those aspects of the business decisions, because there's also, as equally important as just what you're saying, if you don't collect it, then it's a lot easier to protect, and it's a lot less likely or completely unlikely to end up in that S3 bucket that's going to get misconfigured and open to the internet. So that's a really interesting thought process to go through, and a way to understand, when is this useful and when is it necessary, and when is it just collecting the data because we've always collected this data in the past, but maybe it actually hasn't been as helpful as we thought, for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's certain data we have to collect when people fill out a form or register for a webcast. I get it. But
Right.
I'm not tracking which podcasts are you downloading, which articles are you reading. I know if somebody visited the page. That's great. I don't know who you are. So consume as much as you want.
Consume as much and send us feedback. That's why we have those surveys, and that's why we love hearing from listeners. I think from my perspective, that is a much richer type of interaction and much richer type of feedback as well, rather than just trying to reverse engineer what particular geolocation or what particular time zone someone's sitting in.
Yeah, a lot easier too.
Yeah. Well, now we're going to turn our sights onto things that are completely different. And here's an article about decoding the modern enterprise software spaghetti. And this one kind of jumped out to me, not so much for the anything too specific within the article, I have to admit, other than it does make some good points about the difficulty of like software composition analysis. What are the dependencies, within your apps? Some common themes we've talked about. But some of it does lead into another article as well, just about, we talk a lot on the podcast here about the cloud and what's cloud native and DevSecOps in the cloud. but not everyone is in the cloud. And I thought, as we're also coming to the end of the year, one of those good things to sit back and make sure that we also appreciate there's a lot of DevOps teams and developers out there working with legacy software, and they may be working to migrate it, but that migration is tough, especially when you're dealing with spaghetti code and code that's not necessarily very well architected and hard to, nor easy to decompose. So this just was one of those reminders about it, and it does have some bullet points about a list to walk through about trying to evaluate if you're going to refactor code and re-architect code, how do you start to break that down into some non-technical decisions in things like budget, deadlines, just the time it's going to take. These are a lot of social and management decisions as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually going through this process ourselves. Paul and I were actually talking about it earlier this morning, because we're going to start. Look, we've been building our own software for years that does all of our publishing and notifications and email, and it will do more to really help not only our listeners get the content they want effectively, but the notifications for that content and a sponsor onboarding, all the other things, right? But that means you take in what was a big piece of monolithic code, and now we're starting to think about, well, wait a minute, this is really a bunch of things, right? It's a publishing engine, it's a social media notification engine, it's an email, it's a metrics tracking, it's a scheduling system, right? One of these days, we will bring Paul on to actually talk through our own experience of going through this process, because you want to talk about spaghetti code. We've had multiple developers over the year building aspects of this code. Paul's had to clean up over the past number of months. We have a new developer. We start looking at the application. We're like, yes, we're going to start to break it up. So we're starting to architect. We're starting to lay out timelines and dependencies to do that. We'll actually have a really good model to share back with some people on kind of the process we went through to do this. Because to your point, this takes time. This is not something that happens overnight. If we want to talk about digital transformation and all the greatness, it takes time. And there's going to be a lot of decision points we have to make over the next number of months to get us where we want to be, to have an application that we think performs and provides the functionality that we want in the right architecture, so we can do all the really cool things around DevOps in the future too.
I would love to have that conversation, because one of the other things that one of the other points in this article is also talking about just how many tools different organizations have just to literally do like asset management or code management, like dependency trees. And that also speaks to one of the themes that Sandy was bringing up, though, talking about bot platforms, that there's so many out there. She was capping her research review to 40. So it's this idea that there's a lot of tools out there, and a lot of people are using actually multiple tools. But that also, for as complex as your code may be, now you have complexity of management. And more tools doesn't necessarily mean better, unfortunately. It may just mean that some are working a little bit better for this one particular scenario, but not as good as the other tool in this scenario, or for this particular use case, or it doesn't connect well, or the data isn't normalized as nicely. So just hearing some of Paul's, and to be fair, some of your struggles through this would be an interesting discussion to have from that people, processes, and tools component as well.
Yeah, because I really know what the requirements are, right? It's up to Paul and Marcin to actually code it and bring it all together. So they'll have a lot more insight on what my high level requirements actually meant from a coding perspective.
Don't worry, I won't start quizzing you on Git commands.
Yeah, thanks.
We've got some two articles under food for thought, and kind of wanted to revisit SSRF. We talked about AWS just updated their metadata service last week, and we talked about it. And we talked about the Capital One breach as well, that was pointed to as an example of SSRF accessing a metadata service. And this particular article, there were a couple, it kind of just reinforces a little bit of that message. It's pretty much summarizes what we know. It also summarized a little bit of what we talked about in the sense of pointing out how, not Amazon, Azure So Microsoft had done a lot with header tokens in order to make these types of attacks very difficult to exploit against their metadata service. Is pointing out that GCP had also recently made some changes, and then AWS catching up just within the last week or so about the same. But what's interesting here is that they're still just in this talking about more of that responsibility for where the security lies and who needs to do what, is that all these service providers protecting their metadata service is a good thing. But what they're doing is they're targeting and weakening the exploit or how SSRF is exploited. They're not actually fixing the problem. And this is a lot like the content security policy headers that aren't really fixing cross-site scripting. They're just saying if you had a cross-site scripting flaw or vulnerability in your application, this will make it a lot more difficult to exploit, a lot less impactful, which is still a good thing, but it still means you've got code to fix. So even if we're talking about Azure, GCP, now AWS, quote unquote, fixing or hardening, I think is probably the better way to say it, their metadata service, you as the application developers still have some code to fix and make sure those SSRF vulnerabilities don't get there in the first place.
Yeah, in the case of this Jira bug, it requires you to do some basic patching of your system still, right? I mean, sometimes this isn't just a code fix. It's an infrastructure component fix. It could be, patching your software, patching your systems. So, these things still exist out there. So Marcin, make sure that our new Jira instance is not susceptible to the CVE 2019-845-1.
Yeah, you've had since August, so we'll just this will be the polite reminder to please double check that patching because there are bots out there scanning for this. And this talks about, like we talked about, bug bounties and people looking for this. This is one of the easiest ways to earn, especially with an SSRF that can hit a metadata service. I'm going to guess that's at a minimum a $1,000 type of bounty, possibly even $5,000, depending on what information gets revealed out of that metadata service or what you could pivot to from that SSRF. Which actually, and I was double checking my notes, the other thing I wanted to mention I'm going to completely derail us, bring us back to the very first article we were talking about with those SDKs and bug bounties, is that one of the things that was interesting in that article was that it was security researchers that brought this to the attention of Facebook and Twitter in this case. And I know Facebook, and I believe Google has as well, have started to pilot bounty programs for more privacy related bounty programs, basically saying, let us know if an app is violating our terms of service or an app is doing something that doesn't look like it is working or it's working as we intended our APIs to be consumed. So before I forgot, I just wanted to throw that out there as an interesting use of the bug bounty model for data privacy as opposed to just security. But now that everyone has lost track, I'll try to bring us back, Matt, with this final article about DevSecOps adoption and the web security myth. And it's a little bit of just pointing out, too, the idea that there's a lot of legacy code, a lot of legacy apps out there. And DevSecOps, just saying DevSecOps or saying you have DevSecOps practices doesn't immediately solve everything. And you still, just as we were saying now in that SSRF example in Jira, you probably still have to patch something. You still have to fix some code. So you can't rely on the cloud and cloud native solutions to solve a lot of these problems. They definitely make the solutions a lot more easy. They make solutions a lot more consumable because they're API driven. So you can actually write code to manage a lot of this. But not everybody is into the cloud, and so there are a lot of things that people need to do to address those legacy applications.
Yeah, this article spends a lot of time talking about appliances. Okay, I get it. Appliances don't really scale to the cloud. I get that. What I think the better line in here is that organizations which are still using older security technologies should reevaluate this decision. Not only technologies, but approaches. DevSecOps is going to change the way we think about how do we protect code going forward. We have always been a very, from a security perspective, we've always kind of tried to wrap security around an application. I think DevSecOps gives us the opportunity to embed security in the application. And there's a lot of legacy approaches that are trying to be applied to cloud native technologies in the cloud, in the DevSecOps model. Just like the appliance, they don't necessarily work in this new model. So reevaluation not only of some of your solutions, but some of these approaches, I think, are going to be very important for this concept of DevSecOps to really be successful. It requires a lot of integration to a pipeline, which requires a lot of API integration along that pipeline. And it's going to require, I think, new solutions that you're not used to using. And so I think there's a broader discussion here to have. I think the reevaluation is very valid. I just would not limit this to the appliance component that this article talks about, because there's a whole lot of other stuff that I think has to be reevaluated during this transformation as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that the appliance here is really just one small example of what you were describing about, DevOps, in the sense of an appliance doesn't scale as easy because it's a lot harder to go and plug in and flip switches on all of these. And now with DevOps, the idea there is that the people running the system are also potentially the people that built it, or that at least can interact with it. And so if set aside the idea of appliance, if your solution isn't API driven, if your solution doesn't interact with others, it doesn't play well with others, it doesn't have a good authentication model for users, and so on, then or it doesn't plug into your deployment pipeline as well, then it's going to fall out of favor. And that is that idea of what I think, I'm trying to build up your point that, modern design is working on what makes it more pleasant to work with, what makes it easier to use, as well as easier to manage throughout the life cycle of this application, this product, or this solution, throughout whatever synonym you want. And that's where, a good DevSecOps approach starts to pick up, and a way to shift that mentality of what is being created here by a particular enterprise or business.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the appliance definitely has its limitations, but so do a whole lot of other solutions that don't have the available APIs or the integration needed to actually succeed in this model. And those are all the things that have to be reevaluated as part of these decisions.
Yeah, and I think we heard a little bit from Sandy was pointing out that, a lot of old appliance WAF vendors have moved to where their customers are, which means move to the cloud. So how do you provide solutions that work with where the customers are, rather than bringing the customers into your own prescribed architecture? And her other point was, what are the actual problems that customers have? So yes, the OWASP top 10 is still relevant to a degree. I'll argue, though, that if you're writing your front end in React.js, that you have a lot less to worry about with cross-site scripting. But now you have a lot more to worry about with bots and fraud, especially for e-commerce. Or, I love going to concerts and buying tickets, and I'd rather go to a concert with a lot of other people that wanted to be there than a whole bunch of bots and people who are just trying to scalp and make money, who aren't the artists, off of those ticket sales. So I don't think good examples.
Yeah, I don't think bots party as hard as humans actually do.
No, I don't think so. So I think that's a good note to end on, that humans still party, but harder than the bots do, and hopefully humans enjoy Application Security Weekly more than the bots do. So thank you, Matt. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.